So my first recommendation is always, as a professional, take ownership of your professional development. Take ownership of your career.
How should I start processing it, thinking, what should I be doing first to ultimately get this started?
It is 15 minutes a day that you block on your calendar that is dedicated to growth. In the learning science, that's called cognitive load. It's like, how much can you actually absorb at any given time? And there are tools like cognitive load that can help us, once we get into that learning process, to move actually faster by being very strategic.
All right, welcome back to this episode of the How to Get a Job podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about how to grow in your career 1% at a time. And I have someone amazing to share this conversation with. I have Stephen Mostrom. How are you, Stephen? How's it going?
I'm doing great, Daniel. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing excellent, man. Super excited to have this conversation with you. Really excited just to talk about daily improvement because one of my favorite quotes, I think it's by Tony Robbins. So quote, if you know who it is, it's not. It says, we often overestimate what we can do in a year, but we underestimate what we can do in a lifetime. Have you heard
That's
of
amazing.
that quote before?
I've heard that quote. Tony Robbins, that sounds right. He's got so many good ones, but I mean, it's so spot on because, if you think about it, it's like every day flies by. We take action, we, try to grow our careers. And then you look back a year later and you go, wow, I am a different person. I have grown my skills. I've grown my knowledge. I've taken these big strides. And so, yeah, I love that quote. Great way to kick us off and great way to think about, the long-term approach to your career, but breaking it down into these smaller increments, making it more manageable. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's the and this is where I was super excited to talk to you about, because every year around about New Year's resolution, we have these ambitious goals of like, I'm going to get promoted. I'm going to start my business. I am going to, pivot my career. I'm going to lose 30 pounds of weight. And I'm going to do all of this in 3 months or in a year. And it's just so unrealistic. And and again, one of my favorite books to read, and I read it probably once a year, is Atomic Habits. And one of the biggest concepts in that book that really stuck up to me is the 1% improvement every day. And so obviously you speak a lot about that when it comes to career. So, we'll love to hear your perspective and advice on, like, first of all, how did you really get so passionate about this concept of daily improvement? And then let's also talk about how you kind of fell into doing this helping with people when it comes to career itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad you brought up James Clear and Atomic Habits. For anybody who's listening who hasn't checked out that book, I mean, it is probably the number one book I recommend. It's the number one book that I hear other smart folks recommend. So definitely put that on your reading list. And James has such a great approach to this idea of building systems rather than goals. So, I mean, Daniel, to your point, when the new year kicks off and we set these lofty, ambitious goals, it's like, what are the systems that are backing up those goals? If I want to go get a promotion, what is the system that's going to power me to that promotion? If I want to look for a new job, what's the system that's going to power me to that new job? And so to go back to your question about, how I got into the whole career development space, it happened pretty organically. And I think, like most folks, you find things you're passionate about. And through the early part of my career, development was just part of how I was engaging and how I was growing personally. And so I went through undergrad, I went through grad school, and learning was just part of who I was at that time. And it wasn't until I really hit the ground running in my career at Bank of America and stumbled into learning and development and spent years and years in that space that I really started to see, oh, there can be this very formal structure behind career development if you know what you're doing, and you can pull in habit formation, you can pull in psychology, you can pull in these different elements to help grow your career on a very consistent basis, instead of relying on either these goals that might feel too ambitious, or motivation, which we all know is really fickle and comes and goes, right? Those aren't going to be productive ways to grow your career, but there are these other factors you can lean into, like purpose and clarity and systems, that can really drive that continuous 1% improvement.
No, that's so true. do you break that? So if we think about like improvement of career, so like if I'm listening to this podcast and I'm like, hey Daniel, hey Stephen, like I've read Atomic Habits. I agree that focusing on improvement on a daily basis on a habit with systems and processes would generate more long-term success than if I just focus for the next 3 months on doing it. And like, yes, you get a lot of intensity and maybe you get a little bit of growth, but that's just not sustainable. You'll burn out, you move on to a different goal. So if they're bought onto this idea of daily improvement, 1% daily improvement, how would you get started? Okay, it's like, hey, Stephen, I'm sold. I get it. How should I
Yeah.
start processing it, thinking it? What should I be doing first to ultimately get this started?
It's one of my favorite questions, and it's actually what I've built kind of my entire concept around. So my concept, I call it develop daily. And it is the
Mm,
idea that rather than having your development be built around, like we said, motivation or goals, or even what a lot of professionals do, which I call random acts of learning, which is like, oh, I saw, on LinkedIn that I should be reading this book, or I go to this conference, but it's not structured, it's not strategic, it's not driving towards anything. And so what I recommend instead is this daily approach. And what it looks like is it is 15 minutes a day that you block on your calendar that is dedicated to growth. Now, what that growth time is going to look like, that's going to depend on your goals. That's going to depend on where you are in your career journey. So let's say that you are right out of school, you're early in your career journey and you're upskilling. Your big goal is, I want to be a really strong project manager. I want to be a really strong product manager, something like that, right? Then you're going to spend that 15-minute growth period every single day investing in knowledge, investing in best practices, reading up on, what smart folks are doing. If you're in the PM space, you're going to go grab Lenny's podcast and you're going to listen to, 15 minutes a day of that, right? And that's going to be your incremental growth. Let's say you're middle of career and you're focused instead on getting that big promotion from an individual contributor to a manager, right? You're going to go invest that 15 minutes a day. One, building your network, making sure that you're making the connections that are going to lead you forward in your career. And then two, studying up on leadership and management and making sure that once you get into that role, that you're ready to hit the ground running. And so the system is 15 minutes a day. And importantly, that time is blocked on your calendar and it's protected. You're not going to let that, slide by. It's not going to be something where it's like, I'll just kind of, get to 15 minutes if I get to it. It's like, no, this is protected time. And the way I recommend folks do that is put it on your calendar, but also let other folks know, especially your manager. If you're in a corporate environment, let your manager know, hey, like I want to block off 15 minutes a day of dedicated growth time. Here's kind of where I'm thinking. Can I get your buy-in to say this is protected time? I'm not going to have meetings put there, fire drills, things like that. Is it going to work out perfectly every single day? No. But having that system that you're falling back on, James Clear, one of his other big things is don't miss twice. So it's
yes.
like, okay, I had one day where, I didn't hit my 15 minutes, but it's my system. It's on my calendar. So the next day I'm just picking right back up and running with it.
Yeah, I know so many great things there. Like I loved like the last example of like don't miss twice, because if you do, then you're setting a habit for the other direction. You're setting the habit of not doing it every 15 days. But I
That's it.
love one thing you mentioned that was super interesting, like great and interesting, is the concept of having a conversation with your manager, getting their buy-in, right? Especially if you have a company that sets really clear goals of saying like, hey, if you want to hit above expectations or meet expectations. Let's say most of you listening to this are probably high achievers wanting to hit above expectations, right? And you know exactly what needs to happen, right? Whether on the number side, on the people side, and that's a PepsiCo term. Like, like my
Mhm.
when I was at PepsiCo, my performance rating was two main numbers: my numbers, like my KPIs, and then people side, like leadership, because I
Yep.
was in a leadership role. And so clearly understand what I need to do, and then understand where is there a skill gap on the soft or technical skills that I need to close, and then what
Mhm.
are the things that I can do to do that. And whenever you get your manager's buy-in to say, hey, I want to be able to achieve above meet, like exceed expectations this year. If I hit these goals and if I learn this skill, if I do this, can you see, is there any particular reason why you wouldn't be able to give me that score, right? And sometimes it's out of their control, some this, to some extent, but most of the time they have massive amount of control. And then saying, do you mind if I then block it out, right? And whether it's 15 minutes, 30 minutes, or maybe like whatever that you're able to generally do in a repeated way, right? Because if you put an hour
Mhm.
today, but you can't repeat that every 1 hour every single day, then you're better off doing 15-minute chunks, like you mentioned.
That's
And
it.
now they're involved, and then you update them on the progress. I think that's super valuable. And I think your manager is going to increase the perceived value that you're bringing even more, on top of you increasing your skill sets, which is awesome.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this topic up because it's so important. And I think it's also something that folks at various stages of their career are surprised by. Most managers do not take a proactive approach when it comes to development. And there's a lot of reasons why, and we could talk about that. But the short of it is that if you look at the data, upwards of 60% of professionals don't get formal training at work. And even if you're in an environment where there is formal training available, there's no guarantee that your manager is going to set up a dedicated development plan with you. And so, my first recommendation is always, as a professional, take ownership of your professional development, take ownership of your career. Because if you're going to sit back and wait for your manager or your L&D program to step along, like, you're basically handing over the keys to your career to another person or an organization that may or may not be stepping in to do that. So my first recommendation, always take that ownership piece. And once you have that ownership piece in place, then it is, let's go to your manager and have those conversations. And like you said, most managers are thrilled about that conversation because it shows that you're investing in your career, that you're looking to perform at a high level, and then it can be collaborative. One of my favorite things to do is to go in and ask a manager, like, can you give me feedback? Where are you seeing me perform at a high level? Where are you seeing opportunities for me to improve? And then right there on the spot, let's say they give me an area of opportunity, like, hey, you need to be a little bit more outspoken in meetings or something like that, right? Then I'm going to say, okay, let's throw together like a real quick back of the napkin development plan on how I can do that. And I'm going to start marching towards that 15 minutes every single day. And I'm going to send you updates once a week. That's an example of how you can really gain that manager buy-in and show them that, like, hey, if you point out an area of opportunity, I'm going to run right after it and I'm going to go close that gap.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's incredible. Let me ask you a question following up on this conversation. So I got my manager's approval. I have the determination to spend 15 minutes a minimum a day on personal development and improving my career. How should I figure out where should I be spending my time? Because, at the end of the day, 15 minutes is not a lot, but if you put more, then maybe it's not realistic to do consistently. So is there a way that you are thinking through or processing or analyzing on, like, how do I determine which is the first skill to tackle? How do I determine if I need to go technical skills or soft skills? Like, where should I start in that scenario?
Yeah, this is a great question. So a couple of things come to mind. The first is, we're talking about clarity, right? And I'm sure this is something that you use a lot with your clients. It's like, how do we gain that clarity over where you want to go, what you want to do, what that's going to look like, right? Without that clarity, you're going to fall into that bucket of what I said earlier, random acts of learning. You're going to fall into that bucket where you're just doing stuff, but it's not driving towards a very clear career goal. So you got to figure out, what is my next step? Is it a promotion? Is it pivoting into a new role? A couple of things that I find really helpful there. One is, if you have the availability and the opportunity, work with a career coach. Career coaches have dedicated systems and their own experience where they can walk you through sort of like a formal structure to analyze your superpowers, your strengths, and figure out where in the market those are best going to fit, right? So if you have that opportunity to work with a career coach, so powerful. Even if you don't, or if the resources don't make sense or something like that, there are other tools. StrengthsFinder is one of my favorites. And so if you go to Gallup StrengthsFinder, they're going to give you your top 5 strengths, and they're going to point you towards certain career fields that really align with that. So especially if you're in a career and you're feeling like, I don't know if this is where I belong long term, it's like, go take your StrengthsFinder, see where some of your strengths align, and then start thinking about that. Finally, one other thing that I find really helpful is, sometimes I'll just go comb through job boards, or recommend folks comb through job boards and see what kind of jobs like jump out at you. And you go, oh my God, that would be an amazing job to have. I would be so excited to do that job. And then start looking at the skills that go into that job. Go find other people who have that job on LinkedIn and look at what their background and what their experience is, and compare that to where you are. And then that's going to show you where those gaps are, right? So let's say that you're looking at a senior product manager role and you're currently in, a program manager role, and you're wanting to make that big leap, right? So then you would go find senior product managers on LinkedIn, or you would go find job descriptions. You'd come through there and you go, oh, okay, here are the 3 or 4 skills that I really need to get better at in order to make that leap. And then I'm going to build my, 15-minute develop daily approach around those key skills.
That is brilliant. It's brilliant in a sense of like having a systematic way of doing it. That reminds me a lot of a work I did with one of my clients. I actually posted about this like 2 weeks ago. of how he was like, hey, Daniel, like I graduated a year from now. So I work with a lot of college students, right? And like
Mhm.
I graduated in a year from now, and I wanted to know like how do I know what skills I should be focusing on building for the next year? And I said, okay, like when you graduate, what are the type of job titles that you'll be applying to? So like software engineer one, associate, like data analyst, right? All right, find 10 job openings that you're currently on. Look at the job description, right? And where it says the requirements, what happens is that companies are going to list the most important thing up top and the least important things in the bottom. And go on Excel, and then you post the jobs, and then if it's the number one thing on the job description, you give it 10 points. And if it's the
Yeah.
last, you give it 1 point, just the first 10 things. And if you do that for 10 jobs, you're going to be able to clearly see, okay, which one has the highest number. And then you're going to be able to say, okay, I need to learn Python. Python is the number one skill I need to learn. And then now you have, using data, a way to say, okay, this is the one that I need the help with the most because they're requiring this much Python skills. I have this, I have to close the gap. And then the next question is now, okay, what resources? And to your point, I think speaking to people who have the job can tell
Right.
you, hey, this is how I learned it. I followed this YouTube channel. I did this lead code
Mhm.
exercises, or I watched this Udemy, or I got this LinkedIn Learning, whatever
Yeah.
that might be. Or I just literally bought Python for Dummies and I did every exercise on the
Mhm.
book. And then you're
Yeah.
able to see themes and then go ahead and execute and do it on a daily basis and then build the habits of it. And I can tell you, for me, like as an avid I read my first book when I was 18 years old. I was the
Mhm.
type of kid that did not read summer reading. Back then it was Cliff Notes. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You would use Cliff Notes. It
Yeah.
wasn't like you go to ChatGPT and just type, can I get a summary for Moby Dick? Like
Mhm.
that didn't
Yeah.
exist.
Yeah.
um or I would get the audiobook version in the public library and I would listen to the
Mhm.
CDs to be able to get the summary. And
Mhm.
after I realized the importance of reading is that I built a habit of reading one book a week.
Mhm.
Sorry, I started one book a week, but then I wasn't remembering anything. So then I went to reading one book every 2 weeks, became way more doable because that's
Yeah.
an average about 10 pages a day. But yeah.
I'm really glad you brought up this topic of kind of learning science. You're almost like mentioning learning science without maybe even meaning to. Like this idea of you started reading books, you realized that the speed at which you were trying to absorb information was too fast, and so then you scaled it back. In the learning science, that's called cognitive load. It's like how much can you actually absorb at any given time,
Mm.
and there are tools like cognitive load that can help us once we get into that learning process to move actually faster by being very strategic. So if you come hang out with me on LinkedIn, for example, I'm talking regularly about learning science tools like spaced repetition. If you space out your exposure to a topic, you actually learn much more effectively. I talk about tools like active recall, where if you force yourself to basically recall information, like think about flashcards, like turning it over and like, oh, do I actually know this topic, or am I just kind of remembering what I read in the book, right? These are simple tools that can really accelerate your learning process. So going back to, let's say you're, looking to upskill in Python and you want to do it quickly, right? There are some very simple but often overlooked tools that you can use to speed up the amount of time it's going to take you to get that skill. So with something like Python, like doing a lot of examples, getting into some kind of learning community where other folks are talking about Python, like these are simple ways that you can, instead of taking 6 months, you can do the same thing in 3 months.
Yeah. No, I love that because I think I learned it the hard way, right? I learned it the
Mm,
hard way of after like a year of reading a book a month. I remember talking to a coach because I'm a firm believer of coaches, career
yeah.
coaches, business coaches. Like best way to reach any goal is to learn from someone who's done it. And I was
Mhm.
super proud. I was like, yeah, I read one book a week. I was super cool. And I remember going like, oh, awesome. Can you name the last 20 books you read? I couldn't even name the titles. Like I couldn't even.
Yeah.
I mean, like
Yeah.
I could go to my library and be like, I read this book, right? But I
Mhm.
couldn't like just out of the top of my head remember the last 20 books that I've read. And that just told me like if I can't remember the title, what makes me think I remember anything, right? And I'm sure
That's
they
it.
would come up in conversations, but it wasn't giving me the best return on my time. Where to your point, if I was spreading it out more, I would be more effective. And it's the same thing as I think about some of the most challenging things that I've done, both physically, mentally, like running, like training for a 70.3 Ironman. You
Mm.
can't train for an Ironman in one day, or let alone 1 week or 1 month. Like if you don't start training 90 days before at a minimum, if not 6 months to a year, there's no way of doing it, because you can't expose your body to 24 hours worth of training and then go expect to run this race.
That's it. I mean, and yeah, I love that comparison of athletics, because our minds in many ways work the same way that our muscles do. It's, you need to stretch, you need to get outside your comfort zone, but you need to do it in incremental steps, right? It needs to be, oh, I'm going 5% outside my comfort zone today, right? Or if I'm working out, I'm going to lift, 1 extra rep or 2 extra reps. If I'm doing my Ironman, I'm going to run 1 extra mile, right? When it comes to improving our mental skills as well, it's the same idea. It's, how do I get outside my comfort zone? So if I'm trying to grow in my networking skills, like how do I have one more conversation with somebody who maybe isn't somebody I would normally talk to? If I'm
Yeah.
trying to grow my technical skills, like how am I taking on a unique challenge in something that I haven't tried before? And so I'm forcing my brain to be, really engaged, versus what a lot of us fall into, which is kind of that autopilot. So I don't know if you've ever fallen into this with like your Ironman training, or, with other things mentally, but it's like, oh, this is comfortable. I've done this before. I'm going to go, run 3 miles because I've run 3 miles before, instead of going, I'm going to run 4 miles because 4 miles is stretching me. It's pushing me outside of my boundaries.
No, yes, absolutely. Um, Steven, any other things you maybe I haven't asked you about that it's important to share when it comes to this concept of like getting better, growing your career 1% daily?
Yeah, I would love to make just a quick plug for growth mindset.
Yeah.
And I'm sure this is the term that a lot of folks are familiar with, but it's often misunderstood. And so what I try to do on LinkedIn is really shed a light on what growth mindset is, and importantly, like how to make it actionable. And so I would encourage everybody who's on here to go read the book Mindset by Carol Dweck. It's a gem. And she originated this idea of growth mindset versus fixed mindset. With a fixed mindset, I am limiting myself by viewing my abilities as fixed, right? So I would look at something like, oh, can I learn Python? And I go, I don't know. I haven't done super well in like learning other programming languages in the past. Maybe I can't learn Python. Whereas with a growth mindset, I'm going to go, this is a unique challenge. This is an opportunity for me to stretch and improve. And I'm going to lean into that. I am going to be aggressive in pursuing things that are difficult and challenging, because I know that that's how I'm going to improve over time. The reason I highlight this is because there's some really fascinating data on the speed at which skills are turning over in the market today. So LinkedIn released a report last year that said that upwards of 25% of top skills are changing every single year. And they've been doing that since 2015. And so what I encourage folks to think about is not only what are the skills that you're going to need for today to make that next career move, but how are you figuring out how to become somebody who is adaptable, who can continuously upskill over time, because the market is changing so fast. It might be that you get into that role and crush it for 2 or 3 years, and then a new technology like AI comes along and completely changes the skills that are needed to be successful. Are you going to be able to adapt, or are you going to get kind of blown away by those market changes?
Wow. Yeah, no, that's so true. Let me ask you a question, because I remember trying to read that book, but I couldn't get into it. So maybe I just got to retry again, because that was probably like 6, 7 years ago. Because that book is not new, if I remember correctly.
Right. It's been around for a while.
It's been for a while, but it's one of those that's always recommended, and I try reading it. But again, after I reading other books that I reread, and I'm like, wow, this book is amazing. Why couldn't I get into it before?
Mhm.
But how different is that from like internal locus of control and external locus of control? Is it the same kind of concept, or is it two different concepts that I'm confusing?
No, I think there's definitely a lot of overlap. I would say growth mindset includes an element of locus of control, like what can
Yeah.
I have an influence over, right? But it also has this element of life throws us challenges, right? The things that are outside of our control. But then how are we reacting to those challenges,
Yep.
right? So it's like, let's say that, I'll use my own personal example. I was in an L&D career for about 10 years. I was at Silicon Valley Bank, and literally overnight, the bank experienced a bank run and completely shut down. And a few months later, I was laid off, right? That is the kind of thing that I never in a million years could have anticipated happening in my career. And if I'm going in with a fixed mindset, then I'm going to sit around and go, oh, woe is me. I can't believe this happened. I'm going to complain. I'm going to do all these things, right? But if I go in with a growth mindset, then I start thinking, okay, well, this isn't ideal. It's not what I was planning for, but it's an opportunity. And so for me, I took that and I used that opportunity to start having some real serious conversations with my wife, with people that I trust in my career, with coaches, things like that, and saying, okay, I have this big career change. What am I going to do with it? And that's where the idea for Develop Daily came from. And now I am in the entrepreneurial space, something I never thought I would do because of that growth mindset, because of looking at a challenge like getting laid off and viewing it as an opportunity to then step forward and start talking about some of the things I'm really passionate about.
No, that's awesome. Stephen, let me ask you a question. How do you, tell us a little bit more about the products or services of people learning, like watching this, listening to this, whether you're watching it live on LinkedIn or you're watching it on YouTube or listening to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and they want to learn more about kind of like this improvement daily mentality and how you work with them. Can you share a little bit more about that and how they can get a hold of you?
Yeah, for sure. So for starters, come hang out with me on LinkedIn. I'm there every day, just like Daniel. We're hanging out, we're sharing advice, we're sharing tips, we're having conversations. For me, I share a lot of what I call development playbooks. These are simple tactical ways that you can improve your career. A lot of them focus around soft skills or technical skills. I also do a lot of curated lists of books or podcasts. I share, things I'm reading, stuff like that. I also have a newsletter called the Develop Daily newsletter. You can find a link through my LinkedIn page. And that's where I'm doing deeper dives. So for example, I'm talking about, learning science in detail in a way that, if somebody wants to go to that next level of really understanding what's going on there, they can dive into that. I share other thoughts about like my own routines around time blocking or learning or things like that. I'll share learning goals that I'm working on and kind of how I'm thinking about it. And then the last thing I'll plug is if you're a leader and you're listening to this call and you're thinking, oh, this is the kind of thing that I want to implement with my team, I offer workshops. And so I'll come in and I'll work with your team. And it's, I call them kind of career power hours, where I'm going to come in and I'm going to work with your team to identify what are some of the opportunities, but more specifically, like how are we implementing a tool like Develop Daily to help the team grow every single day? And how are we engaging with those conversations between our team, our leadership? How are we making sure that everybody has that development and growth focus?
Yep, love it, love it. So if you're listening to this, I will actually, if you're on LinkedIn, I put a tag Stephen on the comments. So if you go there, you can click it there. Everything else in the show notes will definitely add that there. If you're listening to this in the podcast, if you haven't already liked and subscribed, please, that would do us a favor and go ahead and do that. And if you're enjoying this, leave us a review. That's the best way for us to continue to grow this, for us to continue to elevate this podcast to the next level. Stephen, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for all of you watching and listening, and catch you guys on the next episode.
Thanks, y'all.